And hello, everyone, and welcome to this third session as we explore our review and discussion of a new movement called Theology Without Walls. We appreciate you taking a look at this and being open to the questions that we're asking and the proposals we're making, and we're inviting dialogue. We're very much interested at present in having dialogue. That's why our tagline is a conversation for a global conversation for a new earth. We are looking for a global conversation because ultimacy, that which the biblical narrative calls God, is an all-in-all conversation. And this is why Theology Without Walls is a great idea, because we must get beyond the walls that divide all human beings in the realm of their spiritual identity, God identity, ultimacy identity. And so that's what they're pursuing. So today I'm going to conclude comments that I began last week on Christology. Why? Because when you're doing Theology Without Walls, it is our approach, opinion, and our thinking that the largest wall, the biggest wall that's facing theology today is Christology. That Christology is the wall that has divided what has become the world's largest religion from all other religions, and it is an identity that people have taken on for the last 2,000 years. We already looked in previous episodes at the history of worldviews over the last 2,000 years. And we've seen that Christology has been interpreted through a traditional lens, a modern lens, and a postmodern lens. That's the last 2,000 years of worldviews that we've experienced here in the West especially. I know there are other parts of the world that are still going through different worldviews themselves, and that there are places that still have tribal and warrior center of gravities. But for the discussions of Theology Without Walls, we're talking about people that are primarily postmodern because they would consider themselves to be progressive. The fundamental traditional Christian community would look at them as more liberal, if not heretical. So there's three worldviews that have interpreted Christology over 2,000 years, but every one of those worldviews ends up at the same place. And that is that Christology was meant to have an outcome as a world religion. Therefore, Christology was meant to be what it is today: a particularistic form that separates itself in terms of identity. The I am statement. I am a fill in the blank Christian. And so what we're saying is that if you want a theology without walls, shouldn't we be looking for our identity to be in a place with no walls? Shouldn't we be looking for our identity to be related to that which is ultimacy, meaning that which the narrative calls God, theos, etc.? So if Christology is the biggest wall, then that means that we should possibly be looking at a worldview that could do something else with it, could reframe it in some way or another. And that's why we brought in the models of integral consciousness, because we have seen that integral consciousness is a new worldview that's been blooming on the planet over the last few decades or so. And that this integral approach, this to consciousness, when applied to Christology, will in fact make a radical difference in the way we understand the biblical narrative as relates to specifically God identity. So I'm going to take a look at some overall charts here that have to do with identity. And I'm going to look at it, of course, from the standpoint of the narrative. And I've done some Venn diagrams on this before. So yeah, I'll start here. Let me pull that up. Okay, very good. So when I'm talking about identity, I'm talking about the source, our source, the foundation from which all things come. So theology without walls, for those of you that are in seminaries or you teach or you're professors and you have started this discussion, we're specifically asking the question, where is identity to be found? And what we're saying is the narrative clearly says that identity is not to be found in Christology, but rather that it is Christology that points to that which is identity. Christology points away from itself. Jesus points away from himself. Jesus points away from the self to that which is spirit as source, which the narrative refers to as theos, or God. So there's a trajectory of that. The narrative doesn't say that Adam's eyes were opened and then God revealed to Adam, here's the nature of ultimacy, Adam, and here's what you get into with sin and death, and here's what you get into with separation. So let's just cut to the chase right now. I want to introduce you to my son, Jesus. Jesus, I want you to take care of Adam and Eve, and let's just get it out of the way right now. And then we can just go forward from here on out, and you can get your kids and go to church every Sunday. That was not the way the narrative told the story at all. As a matter of fact, Adam just starts a trajectory, and it is a trajectory where identity is initially found through form, specifically meaning attachment to form. Quickly, let me say this, that form, as we have seen in past sessions, is for role and function, and it is not identity. As I said before, I'm a husband, I'm a father, grandfather, CEO, presence. All of those are roles that I have in life, but they are not my identity. I am a Caucasian, heterosexual male. That applies to my biological, racial, and orientation function as a human being, but that's not my identity. My identity transcends all form, including my biological form, my racial form, my orientation forms, and so forth. And so where is identity to be found? Identity is to be found in my source. What is the source? Well, I'm God-breathed. I'm God-created. And as I look at that, and I'm looking at ultimacy, it only makes sense that ultimacy would be all in all, meaning there wouldn't be any existing beings anywhere that wouldn't have the same source that I have. So therefore, what is it that brings about the walls? So the trajectory that we're seeing is that there is form, and I used an example here of form and formless. You can see that the initial identity is attachment to form. Paul is the one that uses this language where he uses after the flesh for the realm of form, and he uses after the spirit for the realm of formlessness. After the flesh has to do with attachment to form. So for example, Jesus was born of a woman. That is his biological form, born under the law. The law that he was born under had to do with his internal form. Form is both external, born of a woman, and internal, born under the law. What do I mean by internal and the law? The law was that which governed and adjudicated the boundaries of obedient, disobedient, faithful, unfaithful, pleasing, displeasing, etc., etc., and You were trying to always be in the box good and not in the box evil, and it required doing. And so the realm of form is always self as source and always doing. Anytime you have forms, they are products of doing. And so after the flesh is a doing paradigm, it is a self as source paradigm, and it is an attachment paradigm of identity that separates people all over the globe. If someone attaches to their tribe in the early days, they're going to have problems with encountering other tribes. The same is true of religion. The history of religion is replete with stories of hostility. And this again is one of the reasons that Jesus came to bring about transformative thinking, was because he was bringing down walls of hostility. That's what happens when we divide and have walls between us. There will naturally be that hostility that comes because I think I'm more than, or you think I'm less than. And that's what happens when you're in that realm of form. Now, Christology is right here in the middle, and we're going to talk about it a little bit here with more content that comes directly out of the narrative, because what I want to do is say, okay, here's the trajectory, but then I want to get into the actual content of the biblical narrative itself. And so I want to specifically cite the data, if you will, that comes from books and chapters and verses, so I'm not just putting some diagram up here and giving you my 2 cents worth on it. But in Christology, there are 2 elements to Christology. One is Christ as God's transformative work, and that's what Christ is. Christ is a word. Again, it's not Jesus's last name. Christ is a word that describes that God is reconciling, transforming the world. God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, herself, itself. So Christ and Christology is the individual, that's Jesus of Nazareth, and the cross symbol. But Christology, we have to remember, in an integral frame, you have both the individual and you have the collective. And so there's a body. And that body is what existed as part of the transformation of the ages after the cross and the movement from form to transform. So the body collective is just as important as Jesus, the individual Christ. So you have an individual Christ and you have a collective Christ. But the question is, are they identity or are they role and function? There's the big 2,000-year-old question. Is Christology role and function, or is it identity? And what we are saying is that Christology is role and function, and its role and function was transformative. And the result of its transformative work was deliverance into that which is formless, meaning deliverance into universal God identity for all. A consciousness that we are all of the Creator. And of course, we all know that 7 billion people on the planet, some of us are more conscious of it than others. And I also know that I am more conscious of things today than I was 5 years ago, and I hope to be more conscious 5 years from now than I am today. And so transformation is that always growing consciousness of that which is my identity. But that which is my identity, meaning God, Theos, and formlessness, is beyond my grasp. I can learn about it, I can grow in it, but I can't grasp it. So I always have infinite growth every day that I get up on the journey. Formlessness, after the Spirit, again, that's the source of identity, is after the Spirit. That's why in Paul's language, this comes from Galatians 4, a paradigm that I use just about every time I start to lay out these concepts with someone who's not familiar with it. Sometimes people will ask me, where do you even start with this? How do you explain to people who maybe are not happy with where they are in their spiritual religious life. Well, I often start with Galatians chapter 4 because to me it's so clear in the way Paul lays out form and formlessness. Paul is making it very clear that after the flesh is that realm of form, and that applies to human doing. And so after the flesh applied to Ishmael, because Ishmael was born through Abraham's doing, whereas Isaac is after the Spirit, and Isaac was born by the power of God. And so Isaac's identity was a prelude to what true identity was going to be once it was fully revealed. And so we know that the work of Christ is, in the very last revelation we have, written by the Apostle John, the revelation of Jesus Christ. What was Christ revealing? Christ was revealing that our universal identity is God. It comes from the Father. It comes from that which all creation came from. So that's where we're going to start with that. And let me go to my next chart here on transform. So I want to look specifically at transform, and I'm going to use just a few examples here on transform, because there are many ways that you can approach this subject, but for the sake of this one session and to hopefully be able to have people who are in Theology Without Walls want to have dialogue, let me use just these examples. The transform period of Christology has two elements to it that involve form and formlessness. The top Venn diagram shows that the first thing that happens in Christology is dying to form. Jesus is the individual who died to form in the sense of the cross. Jesus faced the greatest challenge, temptation that any of us as humans can face, and that is the loss of biological life, because our instinctual self doesn't know anything other than to survive in our biological form. So you have a dying. What is happening in the dying process? It's a dying to form. And so the collective, when they are dying with Christ, Paul said, as many of you as are baptized into Christ have died with him. You have entered into that death. Death to what? Death to form. So in this first century period, this is the last days of form in terms of its role and function for humanity. Form had a necessary role and function. There was a reason why there was a temple, a priesthood. There's a reason why there was genealogy. There's a reason why there was a land and a city of Jerusalem. There's a reason why all of that existed. And that's because as people grew up in their understanding of God, just like little children, you grow up with certain forms that are helping you understand the way relationships work. But those are for childhood, as Paul said. And thinking as a child was part of the process, and that was the process, role, and function of form and temples and sacrifices and so forth, so that we could then understand the transformative work of what it meant for Christ to be the high priest, or what it meant for Christ to be the sacrificial lamb, or what it meant for Christ to sit on the throne of David, or what it meant for Christ to be the last Adam. This Christology is a transformation of everything, all the players and characters that came before, which existed in the realm of form. So there is an end there by form. Form comes to an end, but formlessness has no end. Form has a beginning and an end. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. They represent the realm of form. There was a physiosphere and a biosphere. That's terms used by Teilhard de Chardin. The physics of galaxies and stars and planets, and the biosphere of the planet Earth from which all biological life has come. And so you have that first creation that is form, and we navigate form every day of our lives. That form, though, was never meant to be an attached identity. And so form comes to an end in the sense that there's no longer going to be an understanding of God identity that involves a temple or a priesthood or genealogy or a holy city of God, a geographical city, a geographical land, circumcised versus uncircumcised, ethnicity, male versus female, gender. All of those forms were understood to be and attached to as some type of identity that inevitably separated people. But there's another aspect to Christology as a transformative role and function, not an identity. Christology, first of all, dies to form, but the second thing is it rises to formlessness. So Christology, both for Jesus the individual and the body collective, is a dying and rising transformative action of God. It's God's action in Christ the individual, God's action in Christ the body. God's doing the transformative work, and Christ is the way in which God does the transforming work. But the transformative work of Christology is a role and function. So Jesus is not just the last Adam, he's also the firstborn from the dead. So he's a firstborn one. Jesus becomes the foundational identity from which all formless identity proceeds. Jesus is the first one to be raised from the dead by the Spirit of God. And this, of course, is the way Paul described it in the first few verses of Romans, where he said Jesus was born in the flesh, but he was raised by the power of the Spirit of God. Therefore, Jesus is God's only begotten Son in the sense that he is the firstborn one. He is the firstborn one to enter into this formless world, but soon to be followed by others, a collective who was called ecclesia, from which we got the word church. That ecclesia was referred to as firstborn ones, plural. That was the role and function of Christology, to be the firstborn one, Jesus of Nazareth, and the firstborn ones, the ecclesia or body collective. When we move into formlessness, it's a birthing process. And again, I'm getting ready to read from the narrative on all that I've just talked about to support the trajectories that I'm now proposing. It's a birthing process by which they are birthed or born from death to form and birthed into life in the realm of formlessness, where life abundant actually exists, meaning within the God space, within the God realm. And it's a birthing process, just like it's a dying process. Both dying and birthing are transformational. Today, in the realm of formlessness, I am not a firstborn one. I am grateful for the firstborn ones. I am not part of the elect. What was the elect? Why were these firstborn ones called the elect? They were elected to fulfill the transformational role and function God intended for them. They were elected in that sense. If I extend this body collective through history, then we got to decide today, which of us are the elect? Well, we've tried that for 2,000 years. And where did we end up? Well, we ended up with a Pope, or we ended up with Luther or Wesley or Calvin or Arminianism or Mormonism, or, well, I could keep going towards thousands of Christological interpretations that always end up with self as source, meaning human beings who determine boundaries that define the form of identity. And if you disagree with it, you're outside that form and you don't have that God identity. And that's why I'm grateful for the ones who were elected to suffer the persecution and go through what they went through to die to form in that first century, just as I'm thankful for Jesus, and don't expect to see Jesus walking around on the planet today either. So there are many terms for transform, but because this is an overview, and we could spend weeks and weeks talking more specifically about everything that I've got on this diagram and the previous diagram, I'm going to move along now and just finish what I have to say with some actual data. Let's look at what the actual narrative has to say. And let's start with that idea of the end of form. Because remember, this is two things. It's the end of form. On the one hand, that's Christology is accomplishing. On the other hand, it's the rising to and birthing into formlessness. So look what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7. First of all, he says, "This I say, the time is short." For anyone who's not familiar with presence, we have work that's been done since 1971 on eschatology. And Paul's eschatology is first century history. It's the first century that's defining the end of form, and time itself is a form. You have seconds and minutes and hours and weeks. Time itself was coming to an end. Why? Because it doesn't exist today? Well, of course it does. Just like men and women exist today, and races and ethnicities exist today, but we have detached from it in terms of identity, so that now we understand the essence of our spirit is what is known as eternal, not confined within the walls of time itself. And so Paul says, for the form of this world is passing away. So Paul is very much into form and formlessness. We just have to look within the narrative and rethink some of the things that have been handed down to us that have ignored much of this language. And notice that he says that this form, the form of this world, is passing away. That's transformative language, is passing away. Do you see how transformative that is? It's in the process of passing away. What happens when that form passes away? We're now into the new space of formlessness. When writing to the Hebrews, the author said, "You have come to Mount Zion." Once again, when you read Paul, you'll find that God's space is defined as that which comes from Mount Zion, and the previous paradigm of form will relate to Sinai. Why? Because Sinai relates to law. What does law relate to? The adjudication of form boundaries. Zion is God, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. The heavenly Jerusalem. Notice that Paul's language, even regarding Jerusalem, is transformed language. For in that same Galatians 4 passage that I use all the time, Paul describes Jerusalem in transformed language. He says there's a Jerusalem that now is, but there's a Jerusalem above, and she is our mother. There's a movement with regard to Jerusalem. God was not denigrating Israel. God was not denigrating Jerusalem. God was not putting down people who went and did animal sacrifices, part of the priesthood, genealogy, and all the other forms we named. God was transforming, first and foremost, his beloved people of Israel, who then became the foundation or the root. That's what Paul tells the Gentiles. They're the root of this whole movement, and you have been brought into their spiritual blessings, meaning you have been brought into the transformative work that God's doing with them by showing them first and foremost how he's taking their Jerusalem and he is transforming it far beyond something geographical. Their city of Jerusalem now is a light to the entire world. It's universal space. And to this church of the firstborn, here's our firstborn. That's who they are. They are playing that transformative role as firstborn ones. And the writer goes on to say, God's voice then shook the earth. That was at Mount Sinai. But now he has promised, saying, yet once more, I shake not only the earth, but heaven. Now, this yet once more is indicating the removal of those things that are made, and I'll get to that because I bolded it, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken. Notice the language again. We are receiving. We're in the process of receiving. This is all transformed language. When we take a good close look at the apostolic writings, all of the apostolic writings are transformational in nature, in the sense that they see one world is coming to an end and a new world is coming into being, and it has everything to do with global human identity. And so this indicates the removal of things that are made. Here again, we're in the realm of form, self as source, things that are made. That's what we do as humans. We make things. We even make creeds and dogmas, and we make boundaries, and we make judgments. We make all kinds of things. But those things were being removed because there was a realm coming without walls, without any boundaries, without walls, with regard to identity. And so what was going to remain? Kingdom. What kingdom? God's kingdom. Once again, look at the transformational trajectory. We start with kingdom in the geographical, political form of David, then Solomon and all the kings that followed. And so Israel understands they are a kingdom. There were a lot of problems when Jesus came on the scene and started talking about the kingdom of God, because they were still thinking in terms of form. But Jesus was using transform language and transform concepts to say the kingdom of God, it is not something that you can say, see here it is or see there it is, for the kingdom is within. And this was very strange language when one had their identity attached to kingdom as a form. One final thing I'll note here, 1 Peter 4:7, Peter makes this statement, for the end of all things is at hand. Now, notice this is transformational language. The end had not come, yet it was at hand. That word in the original text is ingus. It simply means at hand. Peter did not have to put that word in there. If he wanted to be nebulous, he just would have left that word out. And he would have said, keep on your toes, everybody. Someday the end is coming. Might be a couple thousand years from now. You never know. But instead, he said, the end of all things is at hand. Now, I want to go back to the way God creates, the creative movement of heaven and earth spaces. Remember that we talked about Chardin's physiosphere and biosphere, referring to the heavens and the earth in that sense. And in the beginning, it is simply God said. And so there is this idea of creating from nothingness, that the heavens and the earth are created from nothingness, the biosphere and the physiosphere. Now Peter says that the end of all things is at hand. What happens when all things end, you end up with no things, no thingness, nothing, no things. And from this nothingness arises, once again, a heaven and earth, yet this time it's not physiosphere or biosphere. It's a new heaven and a new earth that exists within the noosphere, the consciousness of spiritual consciousness, which God has given through the revelation of this amazing narrative. And so it is consistent. These trajectories are consistent in the way that Christology functions and the role of it, rather than being an identity in and of itself. So looking then at the other Venn I had, I said this is birthing into formlessness, and I showed the middle part of the diagram as a birthing process. Well, think about the womb and the firstborn ones, and Jesus is firstborn, and that middle part of the Venn as a womb. Womb is transformative in concept. The womb is birthing. That's transformative action. Something's happening. We're moving from womb into a whole new world. And that's what's happening in this first century time. And that's why Jesus in Matthew 24, one of his primary teachings about eschatology, and this is really where one of the big problems lies with Christology, is not recognizing that Christology is simply eschatology and eschatology is simply Christology. And when you take eschatology and you throw it out into the future, you come up with all kinds of wild interpretations. And I don't need to go through those because, again, Presence is written on that for decades and decades. But Jesus knew that Christology, that world-changing transformation, as he said, these are the days of birth pains. Jesus realized a new space was being birthed, and it was being accompanied by birth pains. Paul picked up on this and echoed and revealed Jesus. That was Paul's whole reason for what he did. He said he came to reveal Christ. So Paul expands on this by saying that the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits. Let's start right here, that we are seeing in the transformation as presented in the biblical narrative that we have two creations. There is, just like we have two heavens and earths. And so we have a first creation and we have a new creation. That's why Paul will also call the people that are being born into that new creation, he will say, you'll become a new creature. Well, creatures make up creations. And so you have this original creation that was put under law and attempts of having God identity through doing and through appropriate belief and obedience and faith and so forth. That creation eagerly waits, transform language, for the revealing of the sons of God. Here is my understanding of identity. We are sons and daughters of God. That's identity. Christology points away from itself to that which is identity, and identity is God, not Christology. The creation itself will be delivered from the bondage of corruption. Why? What's this bondage to? It's bondage to form, adjudicated by the law. And what is the form? It's good and evil. The form is, are you good? Are you evil? Believer, non-believer, obedient, disobedient. And it is a bondage of corruption because form is corruptible. Corruption is impossible in the realm of formlessness. And so where are they going? Into the glorious liberty of the children of God. Here again, what's identity? The children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors, says Paul, check it out, with birth pains together until now. Paul is saying there's a change, transformative change that's happening right then, right at that moment. And he's saying it's the birth pains. Where did he get that language? And so Paul is saying that there's this new space being birthed. And he says, not only that, but we also have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves grown within ourselves, eagerly waiting, transform language, for the adoption, the redemption of our body, meaning this collective body is transforming and becoming part of the redemption of the entire first creation. One last thing that I'll say from about formlessness in the book of Revelation, John's Revelation, which, by the way, eschatologically, John emphasized, blessed are the people that read this book, for the time is at hand. And I can't remember, I used to know the exact number of times that Jesus, as he appears to John in this revelation, over and over again says, behold, I come quickly, behold, I come quickly, behold, I come quickly. And John's writing this to 8 churches 2,000 years ago, behold, I come quickly. None of those churches even exist today. And so you have this transformative expectation of world-changing, new heaven and earth space. And John says, now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Once into formlessness, John sees the first one had passed away. Notice all the other transformative language of Christology it was in the process of passing away. It was in the process of being birthed. It was in the process of transformation. But once John enters into the realm of the new heaven and earth via his vision, he realizes the first had passed away. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem. Jerusalem plays a key symbolic part of the form to formlessness movement from the very beginning of the narrative. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. God is source, coming from God. Coming down out of heaven. Remember Paul's words. But the Jerusalem that is above is our mother. So you have a Jerusalem that now is, but that Jerusalem fell about 40 years after the cross, and it was no longer. And so doesn't it make perfect sense that when one Jerusalem fell, a new Jerusalem would come, that we would not be left homeless, that in fact, this idea that this new Jerusalem had come down is the fulfilling of the transformative work of Christology. And it comes from God. God is referred to as Father. Christ is referred to as Son and also brother. Christ, in relation to me, is brother. And I am son, like Christ was son. And that was the revelation of Jesus Christ, our relationship with ultimacy. But God is Father. After we finish this series, Cody Deese and I are going to be doing a series that we'll put out dates and times for in another week or two here on the Trinity, because Christology and the Trinity is another subject that we feel we need to look at again with regard to roles and functions. Finishing John's Revelation verses that I've got here, and I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the dwelling of God is with humanity. No more walls. Where was the dwelling of God up until that point? It was in the city of Jerusalem. It was in a temple. It was in the Holy of Holies. It was in a form. It was in a building made with hands. That which is self is source. All of that comes to an end so that God may dwell with humanity. The presence of God is with humanity. God will dwell with them. They will be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. And that's where I believe we are today. We are dwelling within ultimacy, that which the narrative calls God. So that is my overview on Christology. Look, again, I keep going and going and going on this, but this is the session that I'm using to introduce the basic trajectory for those of you in theology who are still calling yourself Christian theologians. One comment I would make about your book, Theology Without Walls. Most of the chapters that are in that book were contributed by theologians who call themselves Christian theologians. And what that means is that they attempt to start a discussion of God without walls from within the walls of a Christology that they identify as a particularistic identity. And this is why there's so many people in this book, Theology Without Walls, who want to talk about pluralism, interfaith, multiple belonging, because they want to hold on to their Christological interpretation as an identity. And this is why Theology Without Walls could run smack dab right into a wall, and that wall is Christology. I use the parable of the young ruler who came to Jesus and said, Jesus, I've kept the law. I've done all these things since my youth. I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. What more can I do? And I don't know. Maybe he was expecting Jesus to say, wow, I don't know what else you could do. That's pretty amazing. By golly, you are something. But Jesus knew a thing or two about identity. He didn't debate the guy and say, oh, wait a minute, you kept the law and didn't have any times in your life when you blah, blah, blah. No, Jesus went right to his identity and he said, okay, go sell all that you have and give to the poor. Jesus hit him between the eyes with his identity. And what was the reaction? He walked away sorrowfully. I've had many conversations with people, and when I get to this point of defining Christology and saying that identity is God and it's not Christology and it's not a particularistic religion, they walk away sorrowfully. It's a very difficult thing to deal with the loss of long-held identities. But we are at a place in history where presence is saying, well, let's talk about it. Look, it's a global challenge that we're facing here, and we know that people are not finding all the answers they want within the walls of Christianity. For those who are, if they're fundamentalists and traditionalists, or if they're modernists or postmodernists, and they're finding meaning there, they should stay right where they are and continue to find meaning. We are not attempting to go into and inject ourselves into anyone's situation and define what they should or shouldn't do, because that's the paradigm from which we have escaped and been delivered. A paradigm of judgment where I'm trying to tell you what you should do. What you should do is what brings meaning to your life. And now what we're saying is there's a whole group of us. For example, I've got people on the Zoom call and many that are in conversation with us who say, I've been in that. I'm hungry for more. I thirst for more. I long for understanding something that is more in line with ultimacy and universality and oneness and all in allness. And that is the whole purpose of this message. In the next session, I will finish and I will be talking about a transnarrative approach to ultimacy and why that is the next step in our minds toward coming together more and more without division, without walls between us. So again, thanks for joining us for session 3. I hope to see you the next time.